Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. We've talked about the Articles of Confederation and what an epic disaster they were. The only tangible success of the Confederation Congress was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which was successful in doing a few things: outlining how new states should be admitted into the Union and acknowledging the sovereignty of the native tribes within the U.S. border. It was also important as it established a firm boundary for slave states, stipulating that all states admitted under this new expansion should be free. Lastly, it helped provide a framework for government of the new territories until said time that they had sufficient population numbers to request entry into the Union. But aside from the Northwest Ordinance, there was not a whole lot of successes within the Articles or the Congress, and this came into succinct focus in the aftermath of Shays' Rebellion. But what was the answer to the failures of the Articles? Adding some amendments? Increasing the overall authority vested within the Congress? Or creating a standalone, brand new document to act as a framework for new government? As it turns out, fate would elect for a brand new governing document. But it wasn't going to be easy. So, just how did the delegates manage to toss out the mutual agreement between the states and replace it with a large centralized government? And who was involved? Grab your coffee, peeps. Let's do this. I know I have bashed on the Articles, so to be fair, I think it's important to highlight one key factor that explains why the Articles were so ineffectual. The Articles of Confederation were never meant to establish a governmental framework. As it stood, each state held its own constitution outlining their local government structure. The Articles were meant simply to create a partnership between the states. However, regional needs and interests would always overrun any broader sense of unity, and it was every state from themselves. Damn the consequences. The states could never truly be cohesive without a centralized framework. The partnership established within the Articles was just that, an agreed partnership. And this is why the Articles were doomed from the beginning. So when Shays' Rebellion popped off and Massachusetts was left to fend for itself, ultimately relying on a privately raised militia to thwart the uprising, it became apparent that there might be something to this whole centralized government concept. Several of the Founding Fathers were desperate to see an update to the Articles, including John Jay, who wrote, quote, "It is my first wish to see the United States assume and merit the character of one great nation, whose territory is divided into different states merely for more convenient government." End quote. However, this wasn't an opinion shared by all. In fact, it wasn't even an opinion held by the majority. Many states felt there was no need to make changes and believed the Articles were working just fine. States did not like the idea of some central house of government far away telling them what to do. As they had just fought a war to get out from this, they were more than weary about recreating the same structure. But, as fate would have it, a mixture of events and men would come together at the right time to push forward this idea of a new governmental framework. This included a handful of prominent and nationalist-minded individuals working in the background to secure a complete rewrite of the Articles, and who proved heavily influential in the Constitution's creation. Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and James Madison would all play pivotal roles in convincing others of the need to reshape the government and just how that new government should look. It started innocently enough. States were growing increasingly frustrated with the disagreements over interstate commerce. However, the weak Confederate Congress had no authority to override any state border or trade law, and therefore states were left to fend for themselves in trying to resolve the issues. To ease the frustration, John Tyler, a Virginia delegate, proposed a meeting of the states to review the issues surrounding trade and attempt to come up with a resolution on the matter. However, when the meeting commenced in September of 1786 in Annapolis, only 5 states sent delegates, which made the hope of addressing the issue of interstate commerce a pipe dream, as the Articles required at least 9 states to be present to pass laws. So, if they couldn't address the trade issue, what the heck were they going to do? New York delegate and Broadway superstar Alexander Hamilton proposed a larger meeting of the states the following year in Philadelphia to review in earnest the defects of the Articles of Confederation. The proposal passed unanimously, but, of course, with only 5 states in attendance, it really didn't amount to a hill of beans. One of the challenges of the Confederation Congress was getting the necessary delegates from the states all together at the same time. So now that there was this proposal to amend the Articles out there, how could they guarantee people would actually show up? Enter James Madison. Madison, a bookish, quiet fellow, would take it upon himself to get the one man needed to legitimize the call for the new convention, George Washington. Washington, who held strong nationalist views, but had previously announced his retirement from public service, was hesitant to break that promise. He was also concerned about his legacy. As it stood, Washington knew history would remember him as the commander-in-chief of an army that liberated the colonies. Did he really want to put his reputation on the line to attend some convention that was likely to fail and produce no real benefit? But Madison knew Washington's attendance would provide a heavy influence on other state delegations who might otherwise be unconvinced to show up. If Washington was there, the thought went, the convention and its goals deserved special consideration and attention. Over the course of several months, Madison played one of the best games of political poker ever imagined. After initially declining a request to participate in the convention, Madison, in cahoots with the Virginia governor Edmund Randolph, appointed Washington as a leader of the Virginia delegation. Madison pleaded with the general to just think it over and not refuse the appointment right away, in case situations changed and Washington decided to participate. The general hesitantly agreed. And that was all Madison needed. With Washington tentatively attached, the convention suddenly had gravitas. Madison would use Washington's tacit and very precarious potential participation as an absolute and floated his attendance to other states. Madison also hedged his bets, though, having Benjamin Franklin waiting in the wings should Washington ultimately decide against attending. His ploy worked, and suddenly delegates from around the country were readying themselves for a trip to Philadelphia. But how was he going to convince the other states to throw everything out and start over? Washington's attendance was important, for sure, but even he was not a guarantee that the delegates would agree to establish a centralized government. And so Madison took it upon himself to spend as much time researching confederacies as possible. He looked in the history books from the beginning of time and outlined their pros and cons in the ultimate example of defending a dissertation. In his mind, if he could prepare all the arguments as to why the Confederacy was destined to fail, he could gain more support from the delegates present to adopt massive change. One of the major deficiencies of confederacies, in Madison's research, was the lack of central jurisdiction over the sovereignty of the states. Throughout history, confederacies failed over and over since there was no single authority vested to decide matters of disagreement between the states. But Madison realized that he couldn't stop with just bashing the existing framework. If he was going to make a point of tearing down the Confederacy, he better be prepared with a solution. And working again in tandem with Edmund Randolph, the Virginia Plan would provide the antithesis to the Confederacy and would propose a large centralized government. The plan called for 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. Sound familiar? The legislative branch would be divided into 2 bodies, the House and the Senate, with each filled with representatives based on overall population. Now, if that sounds a little different from what you remember learning about in high school civics class, that's because this portion of the plan would not ultimately make it through. But we'll save that for the episode all about the convention. So, armed with a notebook of arguments against the Articles, a draft proposal of the way to fix the ills of the weaknesses in their existing government, and the influential George Washington, Madison made his way to Philadelphia. He would be one of the first to arrive, along with Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, James Wilson, Edmund Randolph, and Gouverneur Morris. Yes, someone named their child governor. Weird names are apparently a thing in every generation. As the gentlemen settled in and waited for the others to arrive, discussions surrounding their ultimate goal commenced. Although the proposed convention was meant to serve as a venue for updating the Articles of Confederation, those present were all on board with the idea that the Articles just had to go. The gentlemen understood and accepted the fact that the Articles were successful in achieving the temporary objective of uniting the states in their quest for independence. But, being nationalists at heart, felt strongly there stood a real risk to the fragile country if a more centralized, little r Republican government wasn't established. Because, while the Articles were great at allowing the states to govern on a local level, regional identity would always outweigh any attempt at national unity, and representatives would put their states' needs ahead of any need put forth by the Confederation Congress. These regional loyalties posed serious threats to the country, as seen with the issues of interstate commerce. Without a central vested power, the nationalists felt the country would fall back into the hands of the British, and the revolution would be for naught. It was with this mindset that the nationalists, or Federalists as they would become known, would work to convince their fellow delegates that a new constitution was needed. And with the Virginia plan ready to be presented, they had at least a starting point for debate. And so, as with so many times in history, the stars aligned just right to bring 55 delegates from 12 states to debate the creation of one of the most important documents ever written, the United States Constitution. Be sure to come back next week as I dive into the convention and talk about the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, including all the compromises and drama that came with it. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.